Elizabeth of Austria entered history as a figure carved from both radiance and shadow. The world would later call her Sisi, but behind the beauty that stunned an entire continent lived a woman who feared her own reflection more than any enemy. She had never been meant to wear a crown. Yet destiny, in its quiet cruelty, pulled a free-spirited Bavarian girl into the golden cage of the Habsburg court. Vienna saw an icon. Sisi saw only confinement, marble walls, glittering halls, ceremonies that repeated like an endless echo. People admired her face as if it were a masterpiece, but to her, that same beauty became the curse that ensured she would be watched, judged, and eventually hunted. Walking through the Hofburg, her footsteps seemed to whisper the truth she could never speak aloud. A queen was expected to obey. A wife was expected to submit. A woman was expected to represent perfection for an empire. Yet Sisi never surrendered to that script. The harder the court tried to mold her, the deeper she retreated into her private world, a world where sorrow had weight and freedom shimmered like a forbidden horizon. Elizabeth of Austria's story begins here, a soul so luminous that it turned into the very snare tightening around her life. Her beauty elevated her, isolated her, and ultimately placed her in the crosshairs of a fate far darker than the fairy tale crafted around her name. If you wish to follow her journey through splendor, anguish, rebellion, and the tragedy that struck without warning, you are invited to stay with us, subscribe, and continue walking through the forgotten corridors of history, where even the brightest figures leave the longest shadows. Long before the gilded halls of Vienna claimed her, Elizabeth of Austria lived in a world shaped by open skies and untamed forests. In Bavaria, in the year 1853, she was still Sisi, a 15-year-old girl who rode across the meadows of Possenhofen with her hair unbound, who climbed trees with the fearlessness of a child destined for freedom. Not ceremony, her days unfolded beside the quiet lakes, where she learned the rhythm of nature instead of the rigid lessons of imperial life. Nothing in her upbringing hinted that an empire would one day rest upon her shoulders. That summer, when her family journeyed to Bad Ischl, Sisi expected a simple holiday. The imperial meeting had nothing to do with her. It was her older sister, Helene, who had been invited as a potential bride for Emperor Franz Joseph. Sisi was merely accompanying the family, carefree and unprepared. Yet in the moment Franz Joseph saw her, the course of history bent. He was captivated by her beauty and her effortless vitality, qualities Sisi had never imagined would decide her fate. The match meant for Helene fell away, and suddenly it was Sisi who was chosen. Her life changed without her consent, shaped by a decision rooted not in her will, but in her appearance. As she entered the Habsburg court, the contrast between Possenhofen and Hofburg struck her with a quiet violence. The palace was vast, solemn, and governed by traditions older than any living memory. Where Bavaria had offered air and freedom, Vienna offered corridors lined with expectations. It was here that she first confronted the force that would dominate her early years at court: Archduchess Sophie, her formidable mother-in-law. Sophie was the embodiment of discipline and imperial duty. She welcomed Elizabeth not as a daughter, but as a responsibility to be molded. To Sophie, the young empress was inexperienced, emotional, and in need of control. Their relationship became a silent battlefield. Sophie monitored her routines, shaped her schedule, and expected her total compliance. And because she was not merely a senior figure at court, but Sisi's mother-in-law, her authority reached into every intimate corner of Elizabeth's life. The pressure to produce a male heir intensified the scrutiny. Every gesture was observed, every word weighed, every misstep corrected. Etiquette flooded her days from morning until night. She no longer decided what to wear, where to walk, or how long she might sit with her thoughts. Her beauty, once innocent and unremarked upon in Bavaria, became a kind of imperial asset, admired, but also possessed. The court saw only an enchanting empress, never the isolation that hid behind her delicate features. As months slipped by, she felt the freedom of her youth erode. The forests and lakes of her childhood became memories she clung to as if they were lifelines. Each new rule tightened the walls around her. Each whisper of admiration hardened into a reminder that she was valued for all the wrong reasons. And quietly, beneath the splendor of Vienna, the girl who once belonged to the wild began to disappear, replaced by a woman fighting to remember who she had been before the empire claimed her. Vienna soon discovered that the empress possessed a beauty unlike anything the court had seen, but what the world celebrated, Sisi experienced as a growing burden she could not set down. As the expectations surrounding her image expanded, something inside her shifted. She began to believe that her worth depended on a perfection so absolute that it could never be reached. And so, without ever declaring it, she entered a private war with her own body. The first signs of this war appeared in the routines she imposed upon herself. She limited her meals to near starvation, convinced that any softness would betray the ideal she was expected to embody. Days passed when she consumed little more than broth, fruit juice, or a simple slice of orange. Hunger became a quiet companion, a reminder of the control she wished to maintain over the only realm left to her. She disguised this discipline behind smiles and long walks, but the truth was harsher. She was not sustaining herself. She was sculpting herself into an image that pleased everyone but her. Her exercise regimen grew equally merciless. She trained with the determination of an athlete rather than an empress. Hours vanished as she practiced gymnastics, rode horses, or walked at a punishing pace through palace corridors. Servants whispered that she moved as if chased by something no one else could see. In a way, she was. She was fleeing from the fear of imperfection, from the gaze of a court that never blinked, from the voice inside her that insisted beauty was her only armor. But the clearest symbol of her obsession was her hair. It fell past her knees in a cascade of chestnut that required hours of care each day. Attendants worked through the strands with delicate precision, and any broken hair would fill Sisi with frustration. The ritual became a prison of its own. She sat for endless sessions, motionless, while the weight of her hair pulled at her scalp like a crown made of gravity. Admirers called it magnificent. To her, it was another responsibility she could not escape. Yet nothing tormented her more than the mirror. To others, a mirror is an object. To Sisi, it became a silent judge. She faced it every morning, searching for flaws no one else could find, tracing the faintest shadows beneath her eyes, scrutinizing the lines that life inevitably carves into every face. She feared aging with a desperation that darkened her days. Each passing year felt like a threat, each wrinkle a reminder that beauty was fleeting, and that the empire valued her most for something she could never keep. The mirror reflected her features, but it also reflected her captivity. It reminded her that she had been transformed into an icon rather than allowed to remain a woman. The world admired her radiance without seeing the cost of maintaining it. Behind the shimmer of her public image lay exhaustion, self-doubt, and a loneliness sharpened by the knowledge that she was fighting a battle she could never win. And as she stared into her own reflection day after day, she began to understand a truth far more tragic. It was not the court that held her prisoner anymore. It was the illusion of perfection she had been forced to create, a vision that demanded every breath, every choice, every fragment of her spirit. For all the pressures Elizabeth endured as empress, nothing wounded her as deeply as the losses within her own family. The tragedies that unfolded across her life did not strike at once, but each carried a weight that reshaped her spirit. And the first blow came with the death of her young daughter, Helene, a child whose presence had briefly softened the sharp edges of court life. Illness took the girl before Sisi could gather enough memories to sustain a lifetime. The palace mourned with formality. Sisi mourned with a silence so profound, it seemed to swallow the light around her. She had already felt powerless in many aspects of her life, but this loss deepened the sense that fate itself had turned against her. As the years passed, she tried to bury her grief beneath travel and distance, believing that movement could keep sorrow from settling permanently in her heart. But grief has a way of waiting, and it waited until the night it struck her a second time, far more brutally. This time the victim was her only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, the heir whose existence had carried the hopes of the empire. His relationship with her had always been marked by tenderness and melancholy, two souls alike in their longing for understanding. Yet even she could not reach the depths of despair that began to consume him. In the winter of 1889, Rudolf retreated to the hunting lodge at Meierling, accompanied by Mary Vetsera, a young woman whose devotion only deepened his sense of entrapment. When word arrived that both had taken their own lives, the empire trembled. Sisi collapsed beneath the weight of the news. The carefully maintained composure of the empress shattered in an instant. She did not scream. She simply folded into herself, as if something essential had been torn away. The aftermath felt like a dim and endless dream. Official statements softened the truth. The court scrambled to protect the dynasty, and diplomats whispered urgent questions behind closed doors. But none of it mattered to Sisi. She was a mother whose child had vanished into darkness, and no ceremony could disguise the enormity of that devastation. Rudolf's death struck at the core of everything she had endured. It confirmed her greatest fear that she could not protect those she loved, that the world she belonged to would always demand more than a human heart could give. After Meierling, something within her shifted permanently. She dressed in mourning and never wore color again. Her presence at court became increasingly rare. She drifted between countries, cities, and coastlines, searching for a place where grief might loosen its grip. But it followed her everywhere, a constant companion. Those who saw her in these years described a woman who moved with the grace of an empress but the emptiness of a shadow. Her steps were light, her voice soft, but her eyes carried the knowledge of tragedies she could never outrun. From that moment onward, Elizabeth lived not as the figure adored by Europe, but as someone suspended between life and memory. The losses of Helene and Rudolf had hollowed her, leaving behind a mother who wandered through her own existence like a ghost, trailing the remnants of a broken heart. After the tragedies that fractured her life, Elizabeth of Austria no longer moved through the world as an empress, but as someone searching for an exit from her own history. She drifted across Europe with a restlessness that unsettled even those closest to her. Greece, with its ancient stones and sunlit ruins. Hungary, where she felt a fleeting sense of belonging. England and Ireland, where she walked along quiet coastlines and hid her identity behind simple clothes and veils. Everywhere she went, she seemed to be running, though she never said from what. Perhaps she ran from the weight of sorrow, perhaps from the reflection she feared. Or perhaps she fled the destiny that had clung to her since the day Franz Joseph chose her instead of her sister. Travel became her escape and her disguise. She boarded ships, trains, and carriages with little warning, leaving attendants scrambling to follow. She preferred the company of strangers who did not bow, who did not whisper her titles, who simply saw a fragile woman in black. She walked for miles each day, sometimes alone, sometimes with a single lady in waiting trailing behind. Her steps were long and purposeful, as if she believed that enough distance could erase the grief that haunted her. Her letters from this period reveal the truth she hid from the world. She wrote of exhaustion that no sleep could mend, of a heart that felt carved out, of an emptiness that deepened with every passing year. Yet she often ended her letters with careful reassurance, insisting she was well, that she found comfort in the places she visited, that solitude suited her. She was determined to maintain an image of calm grace, even as her private words cracked with despair. In her diaries, the contrast sharpened further. Her reflections spoke of longing for release, of a life that felt distant and unreal, of the heavy shadow that followed her everywhere. She documented her thoughts like a traveler leaving notes along a path she did not expect to return to. To those who saw her during these wanderings, she seemed ethereal, dressed almost entirely in mourning black, her face hidden beneath a veil. She moved with a quiet dignity that drew attention despite her attempts to disappear. Some mistook her for a widow, others for a noblewoman traveling discreetly. Few realized they were looking at the Empress of Austria, and Sisi preferred it that way. She did not want recognition. She wanted a life in which recognition no longer defined her. But fate, which had shaped so much of her existence, waited for her in Geneva in the autumn of 1898. She arrived quietly at the Hotel Beau Rivage under a false name, hoping for a few days of anonymity by the lakeshore. Geneva offered a calm she had not felt in years. The air was cool, the water still, the streets peaceful. She planned simple walks, gentle excursions, nothing more. Her world had narrowed to small comforts, to moments of breath between waves of sorrow. She did not know she was being followed. Luigi Lucchesi, an Italian anarchist, had come to Geneva hunting for a royal victim. He wanted to strike at the symbols of power. And Sisi, concealed behind a veil and traveling without an escort, became the easiest target. He did not know her story. He did not care who she was. He cared only that she represented a world he wished to wound. On the morning of September 10th, Sisi walked with her lady-in-waiting toward the steamship that would take them across the lake. The street was quiet, lined with trees. She carried a parasol. She moved slowly, weakened by years of sorrow she refused to acknowledge. As they approached the pier, Lucchesi stepped forward with a quick, abrupt motion. To an onlooker, it seemed like a shove, a sudden collision between strangers. What no one saw was the sharpened needle hidden inside the small steel file he gripped tightly in his hand. The weapon pierced her chest with a single thrust. Sisi staggered but remained upright. She apologized to those around her, insisting she was fine, unaware that the blow had struck her heart. She boarded the ship, took a few steps along the deck, then collapsed as the blood beneath her corset began to spread. Only then did she understand what had happened. The wound was small, almost invisible, but fatal. Those who rushed to her side could do nothing. Within minutes, Elisabeth of Austria, the empress who had spent a lifetime fleeing sorrow, was gone. Her death was swift, cold, and brutally quiet, mirroring the life she had endured. She had fled the court, fled expectations, fled the mirror, fled grief, fled herself. But in the end, fate found her not in a palace, but on an ordinary street in Geneva, ending the journey of a woman who had never stopped running. Elizabeth of Austria left the world as she had lived in it, both admired and misunderstood. A figure whose radiance drew eyes even as her soul carried shadows few could bear to see. Across Europe, her death sparked mourning, grand ceremonies, and elegies that praised her charm, elegance, and presence. Yet beneath the public adoration, there remained a truth that no crown, no portrait, no monument could ever fully capture her life, had been shaped as much by sorrow as by beauty, by captivity as by admiration. Her legend grew swiftly after her passing. Artists immortalized her in oil and marble, capturing the slender form, the long flowing hair, the serene face that had become iconic. Films and biographies later told her story, emphasizing grace and glamour. To the public, she was the empress who had defied the strictures of the court, who had traveled freely, who had charmed emperors and captivated nations. But the records of her private journals, the letters never meant for anyone else's eyes, reveal the deeper torment a woman trapped by her own reflection, haunted by grief, haunted by the lives she could not save, and ultimately by the knowledge that she had never fully belonged. Her beauty, once celebrated, had been a double-edged sword. It opened doors, won admiration, and secured her position in history. Yet it exacted a relentless toll. Each glance of envy, each whispered expectation, each public gaze added a weight she could not discard. The very trait that made her unforgettable also bound her, like chains woven from admiration and fear, to a fate she could never escape. The mirror, the palace, the court. They became extensions of her imprisonment, reminding her daily that she was valued only for the surface she presented, not the life she had endured beneath it. Even now, more than a century later, Elizabeth's shadow lingers across the Habsburg legacy. She is remembered in galleries and cinemas, her hair meticulously painted, her face framed with elegance, her posture perfected for generations to admire. Yet behind every homage lies a whisper of the truth, a life marred by loss, obsession, and a constant flight from the confines of destiny. Those who gaze upon her image may marvel at the beauty, but few dare to confront the sorrow that hid in every gesture, every smile, every carefully maintained expression of serenity. Her story endures not merely as a cautionary tale of fame or appearance, but as a reminder of the human cost beneath the veneer of royalty. Elizabeth's life shows us that even the most dazzling figure can carry darkness so profound that admiration alone cannot illuminate it. Her elegance and charm became an emblem, but the price of that emblem was measured in hours of solitude, in flights across continents, in the relentless discipline she imposed upon herself, and in the grief that never left her heart. The past speaks softly, but insistently. The grandeur of her life cannot erase the echo of suffering she bore, the silence of her chambers, the weight of mourning, and the ceaseless pursuit of an unattainable ideal continue to resonate across time. It is in that silence that the true Elizabeth exists, a woman of extraordinary beauty, extraordinary sorrow, and an extraordinary story that refuses to be forgotten. The quiet of history still carries the sound of royal tragedies, inviting us to witness them, to reflect, and to remember. If you wish to continue stepping into the darkest, most haunting chapters of history, exploring the lives behind the crowns and the faces behind the legends, like, share, and subscribe. Let the shadows of the past guide you further into the secrets the world rarely dares to reveal.